September 1945 thought the war was over. Across the Pacific, the guns had fallen silent. Aircraft carriers sat at anchor. Airfields that had once launched waves of fighters now echoed only with the sound of mechanics packing equipment and transport planes, carrying men home. Yet inside one military hospital, the war lingered in the minds of those who had survived it. A Japanese pilot opened his eyes beneath bright electric lights. For years he had been taught what capture meant. He had heard stories of brutal enemies, of humiliation, of a fate worse than death. Many pilots had chosen to crash into the sea or burn with their aircraft rather than surrender. Now, wounded and far from home, he expected punishment from the people he had spent years fighting. Instead, an American nurse adjusted his blanket. Another brought water. A third smiled and asked if he was comfortable. The pilot stared in disbelief. Nothing in his training had prepared him for this moment. The enemy he had feared was treating him not as a defeated warrior, but as a patient. And he was not the only one whose understanding of the war was about to change. The story begins long before that hospital bed. In a nation where surrender had become unthinkable and where thousands of young aviators were taught that captivity would destroy both honor and identity. The story began decades before the final months of the Second World War. During the early 20th century, Japan emerged as one of the world's rising military powers. Victories in the First Sino-Japanese War and the Russo-Japanese War strengthened national confidence and reinforced the belief that discipline, sacrifice, and loyalty could overcome larger opponents. By the 1930s, these ideas had become deeply embedded within Japan's armed forces. Military leaders drew heavily upon interpretations of Bushido, the historical code associated with the samurai. Although the realities of samurai life had been far more complex, wartime education transformed Bushido into a powerful message for modern soldiers: absolute loyalty, unquestioning obedience, and willingness to die for the nation and the emperor. From the first days of training, young pilots were immersed in this culture. Cadets entering naval and army aviation schools endured intense physical conditioning, strict discipline, and relentless instruction. Flying itself was dangerous. Even training accidents claimed lives. Yet instructors often emphasized something they considered even more important than flying skill: the mindset of a warrior. Aviators were taught that their duty continued until death. Surrender was portrayed as a moral failure. Capture was described not merely as defeat, but as a disgrace that could stain a family's honor. Stories of soldiers choosing death rather than imprisonment circulated widely throughout military education and public propaganda. At the same time, Japanese newspapers, radio broadcasts, films, and official publications presented a highly distorted image of the enemy. Americans were often depicted as cruel, materialistic, and lacking discipline. Such portrayals served a strategic purpose. Leaders wanted soldiers to fight harder, resist longer, and avoid surrender at all costs. As the war expanded across Asia and the Pacific after 1941, these messages intensified. Young pilots climbed into fighters, bombers, and reconnaissance aircraft carrying not only weapons and fuel, but years of conditioning about what awaited them if they fell into enemy hands. For many, the prospect of captivity seemed more frightening than combat itself. Then reality began. The challenge, those beliefs. By 1943 and 1944, the balance of power in the Pacific was shifting. American industrial production was overwhelming Japanese resources. New battles erupted across vast stretches of ocean and island chains. The aircraft losses mounted. Experienced aviators became increasingly difficult to replace. And for the first time, growing numbers of Japanese pilots found themselves facing a possibility their training had insisted should never age. They were surviving combat only to become prisoners. Many Japanese pilots entered the final years of the war believing that captivity would be worse than death. By 1944, the Pacific War had entered a brutal, new phase. Across thousands of miles of ocean, American forces were advancing toward Japan through a series of costly campaigns. The battles for the Battle of Saipan, Battle of Light Gulf, Battle of Iwo Jima, and Battle of Okinawa consumed ships, aircraft, and lives on an enormous scale. Air combat became a daily reality for thousands of pilots operating from carriers, island airstrips, and increasingly vulnerable bases in the Japanese homeland. For Japan's aviators, the situation was growing desperate. Fuel shortages reduced training hours. Replacement pilots often entered combat with far less experience than the veterans they replaced. American aircraft, such as the Grumman F-6F Hellcat and the Vought F-3 Corsair, were appearing in overwhelming numbers in the skies above the Pacific. Survival became more difficult with every passing month. Not every pilot who was shot down died. Some parachuted into the sea and were rescued. Others crash-landed on islands captured by American forces. A number were pulled from wrecked aircraft after suffering severe burns, fractures, or internal injuries. These men entered captivity carrying years of fear about what the enemy might do to them. What awaited many of them was something entirely different. The United States military had developed an extensive medical system across the Pacific. Hospital ships crossed dangerous waters carrying surgeons, nurses, and medical supplies. Field hospitals followed advancing troops from island to island. Evacuation networks moved wounded personnel from frontline aid stations to larger treatment centers capable of performing complex surgery. American military nurses became an essential part of this system. Members of the Army Nurse Corps and Navy Nurse Corps worked under exhausting conditions. They treated gunshot wounds, burns, tropical diseases, infections, and psychological trauma. Many served close to combat zones where enemy aircraft and artillery remained a constant threat. Their responsibility was clear. A patient was a patient. Medical ethics, military regulations, and international conventions require humane treatment of wounded prisoners. In practice, individual experiences could vary, and wartime emotions sometimes ran deep. Many nurses had cared for American servicemen wounded by Japanese attacks. Some had lost friends or family members during the conflict. Yet professional duty demanded that treatment be based on medical need rather than nationality. For wounded Japanese pilots arriving in American care, this often created a profound shock. Instead of beatings, they received bandages. Instead of starvation, they received meals. Instead of insults, they encountered nurses who monitored their recovery, changed dressings, administered medication, and sometimes spent hours helping them through pain and fear. The gap between propaganda and reality did not remain hidden for long. Inside hospital wards and recovery rooms, a different battle was unfolding, one fought not with aircraft or bombs, but with perceptions that had been built over years of war. For many captured Japanese aviators, the first days in American medical care were often more confusing than the combat that had brought them there. They arrived carrying assumptions that had been reinforced for years. Some expected interrogation to begin immediately. Others believed they would be neglected, abused, or left to die from their wounds. A number had spent their final moments before capture preparing themselves mentally for humiliation. Instead, they found themselves in hospital wards. Doctors examined injuries. Corpsmen cleaned wounds. Nurses checked temperatures, monitored breathing, and administered medicine according to the same procedures used for American servicemen. The contrast was difficult to comprehend. Many prisoners initially viewed acts of kindness with suspicion. A glass of water offered by a nurse could be interpreted as part of an interrogation strategy. A blanket might be seen as temporary preparation for something worse. Some prisoners refused food during their first days because they feared poisoning or mistreatment. Yet the routine continued. Morning rounds, dressings changed, medicines delivered, meals served, day after day. Nothing happened that matched the terrifying image of captivity they had carried into battle. Slowly, disbelief began to replace fear. The realization was unsettling. If the enemy was not behaving as expected, then perhaps many other assumptions formed during the war were also incomplete. That question lingered in hospital rooms across the Pacific. For American military nurses, these patients represented a unique challenge. Many had spent years treating the wounded from some of the Pacific War's bloodiest campaigns. They had watched young American servicemen arrive with devastating injuries from battles fought against Japanese forces. They understood the cost of the conflict better than most, yet nursing demanded a different perspective. The mission was not to determine who deserved care. The mission was to provide it. Long shifts often stretched through the day and into the night. Wards remained crowded with patients suffering from burns, fractures, infections, malnutrition, and combat trauma. Nurses moved constantly between beds carrying medical charts, supplies, and medications. When a wounded Japanese pilot entered the ward, the workload did not change. His temperature still needed monitoring. His wounds still required treatment. His recovery still depended on careful observation. Many nurses later recalled that once treatment began, nationality often faded into the background. What remained was a human being in pain. Communication could be difficult. Language barriers sometimes forced nurses and patients to rely on gestures, facial expressions, or the assistance of interpreters. Yet basic compassion often required no translation. A reassuring smile, a glass of water, a carefully adjusted pillow, these were small actions. But, for men expecting cruelty, they could feel extraordinary. The Pacific War was fought not only across islands and oceans, but inside people's minds. Years of propaganda had encouraged both sides to view the other as fundamentally different. Fear, anger, and loss made such beliefs easier to accept. The longer the war continued, the stronger these images often became. Hospitals created a rare environment where those assumptions could be tested against reality. Japanese pilots observed American medical staff at close range. They watched nurses work through exhaustion. They saw doctors performing lengthy surgeries. They witnessed the same care being given to friend and former enemy alike. At the same time, American nurses encountered prisoners who often looked very different from the image created by wartime headliness. Many were remarkably young. Some were barely out of adolescence. Others spoke about families waiting at home, careers interrupted by war, or hopes that now seemed uncertain. The distance between enemy and person gradually narrowed. Not every interaction produced friendship. The wounds of war were too deep for simple reconciliation, but repeated contact created opportunities for understanding that battlefield encounters never could. Within those hospital walls, something unexpected began to emerge. Trust. And once trust appeared, it opened the door to stories, observations, and experiences that neither side had expected to share when the war began. For many Japanese pilots, survival itself was made possible by a medical system that represented one of the most advanced wartime healthcare networks ever assembled. The Pacific War stretched across enormous distances. A wounded serviceman could be injured on a remote island one day and receive specialized treatment hundreds or even thousands of miles away days later. To make this possible, the United States developed an extensive chain of evacuation hospitals, hospital ships, surgical teams, and transport aircraft. Japanese prisoners who entered this system often encountered treatments that were unfamiliar to them. Surgeons repaired fractures caused by crashes and combat injuries. Burn specialists treated severe aviation burns. Blood transfusions saved men who otherwise would have died from blood loss. The growing availability of penicillin helped combat infections that had historically killed countless wounded soldiers. To the medical staff, these procedures were routine. To some captured pilots, they were astonishing. Many had expected captivity to shorten their lives, and said enemy doctors were working to preserve them. Nurses played a critical role throughout this process. Recovery often depended not only on surgery, but on careful aftercare. Dressings had to be changed, fevers monitored, nutrition maintained, patience encouraged during long periods of healing. The result was a powerful contradiction. The same nation that had shot down a pilot's aircraft was now investing time, medicine, manpower, and resources to keep him alive. For some prisoners, this realization became impossible to ignore. Military intelligence officers naturally sought information from captured enemy personnel. Pilots could provide valuable insights into aircraft, tactics, training methods, fuel shortages, morale, and operational conditions within Japanese forces. Throughout the war, American interrogators questioned captured aviators whenever opportunities arose. Yet an interesting pattern emerged. Fear often produced silence. Humane treatment sometimes produced cooperation. Many Japanese prisoners entered captivity expecting abuse. When those expectations failed to materialize, some became more willing to speak openly. Historians studying prisoner interrogations have noted that respectful treatment frequently yielded more useful information than threats or intimidation. Medical care contributed to this process. A wounded pilot recovering under the supervision of doctors and nurses experienced American personnel not as abstract enemies, but as individuals. Trust did not appear overnight, and not every prisoner chose to cooperate. Nevertheless, many became increasingly willing to answer questions or discuss their experiences. The information gathered helped American planners better understand the condition of Japanese air forces during the final years of the war. More importantly, for the prisoners themselves, these conversations often revealed how much wartime propaganda had distorted reality on both sides. The hospital became more than a place of healing. It became a place where long-held certainties began to unravel. News traveled quickly among prisoners. Single experience in one hospital ward could eventually be repeated across camps, transport ships, and detention facilities. Captured servicemen exchanged stories whenever opportunities arose. One man described receiving surgery from an American doctor. Another spoke about nurses who brought extra food when he struggled to eat. Someone else recalled being treated for burns despite believing he would be abandoned. As these accounts circulated, they challenged beliefs that many prisoners had carried since childhood. The transformation was gradual. Some men remained skeptical, others believed the stories only after experiencing similar treatment themselves, yet the cumulative effect was significant. Captivity no longer matched the image presented by military propaganda. By the summer of 1945, increasing numbers of Japanese prisoners had first-hand evidence that complicated the narrative they had been taught. Many began writing observations in diaries or recounting them after the war. Years later, historians examining memoirs, interviews, and post-war testimony would discover recurring themes: surprise, confusion, gratitude, and a profound reassessment of the enemy. For wounded pilots in particular, nurses often occupied a central place in these memories. The people they had expected to fear became some of the first Americans they truly came to know. And as Japan moved toward its final months of war, those unexpected encounters would acquire an even deeper significance. The conflict that had shaped an entire generation was approaching its conclusion, and events were about to force both victors and defeated alike to confront a new reality. By the summer of 1945, Japan stood on the edge of collapse. American bombers crossed the skies of the Japanese home islands in growing numbers. Industrial centers burned. Transportation networks struggled to function. Fuel reserves had fallen to critical levels. Experienced pilots had become scarce, and many young aviators entered combat with only a fraction of the training that earlier generations had received. Yet the fighting continued. Across the Pacific, wounded Japanese airmen remained in hospitals, prisoner facilities, and recovery wards operated by American forces. For many of them, survival had already placed them in an unusual position. They were watching the war's final chapter unfold from beds where the enemy was keeping them alive. In those wards, daily routines continued much as they had for months. Nurses checked temperatures, Doctors reviewed charts. Orderlies delivered meals. Outside, however, history was accelerating. During the summer, reports filtered through military channels about devastating bombing campaigns against Japanese cities. Prisoners heard fragments of news from guards, interpreters, newspapers, and occasional official announcements. The information was often incomplete. But one fact became increasingly difficult to deny. Japan was losing for many captured pilots. This realization created a crisis deeper than physical injury. They had been trained to believe that sacrifice would bring victory or, at minimum, preserve national honor. Instead, they found themselves alive while countless comrades had died. Some wrestled with guilt. Others struggled to understand how events had reached this point. The nurses caring for them often witnessed these emotional burdens firsthand. Patients who had initially remained silent sometimes began speaking more openly through interpreters or simple gestures. Conversations expanded beyond medical treatment. Discussions touched on families, hometowns, childhood memories, and hopes for the future. The atmosphere inside certain wards gradually changed. The relationship between caregiver and patient remained professional, but repeated acts of kindness accumulated over weeks and months. A nurse remembering a patient's preferred food, a blanket adjusted during a difficult night, encouragement offered during painful rehabilitation. These moments carried unexpected weight. For a pilot raised on years of warnings about American brutality, such experiences challenged the very foundation of what he believed about the enemy. Then came August 1945. Within days, events occurred that would transform not only the war, but the lives of everyone following it. News of unprecedented destruction reached military commands across the Pacific. Soon afterward came reports of another devastating attack. Then the Soviet Union entered the war against Japan. The pace of history became overwhelming. Inside hospital wards, uncertainty gave way to anticipation. Something enormous was happening, and, before long, the wounded Japanese pilots, recovering under American care, would learn that the war they had dedicated their lives to was nearing its end. August 15, 1945. Across Asia and the Pacific, millions of people paused to listen. For the first time in history, the voice of Emperor Hirohito was broadcast directly to the Japanese people. The recording was formal and difficult for many listeners to understand, but its meaning became clear. Japan had accepted surrender. The war was over. For wounded Japanese pilots recovering in American hospitals, the announcement arrived as a moment of profound disbelief. Many had entered military service, believing that Japan would fight until destruction rather than surrender. Some had been taught that the emperor's forces would never accept defeat under any circumstances. Others had expected a final battle on the home islands that would consume both soldiers and civilians alike. Instead, the conflict ended with a broadcast. The reaction varied from patient to patient. Some sat silently for hours, others wept. A few struggled to accept the news at all. For many, the surrender represented more than a military defeat. It marked the collapse of an entire worldview. Ideas about honor, sacrifice, victory, and the enemy suddenly had to be reconsidered, and in that moment of uncertainty, many of the people closest to them were American nurses. The same women who had changed bandages, delivered medicine, and monitored recovery now witnessed the emotional aftermath of one of the most significant events of the 20th century. Several post-war accounts from former prisoners describe feelings of confusion mixed with relief. The war that had dominated every aspect of life was finally over. The fear of further combat had vanished, yet the future remained uncertain. About what would happen next. Would they ever return home? What kind of Japan still existed? The answers would take time. In the days that followed, the atmosphere inside many hospitals shifted noticeably. Security concerns diminished. Conversations became easier. Interpreters were often used more freely. Patients who had once viewed every interaction through the lens of war began speaking with greater openness. For some pilots, this was when the full significance of their experiences became clear. They reflected on the months spent under American care. The surgeries that had saved their lives, the medicines they had received, the nurses who had treated them with patience despite everything that had happened during the war. Many realized that their expectations had been wrong. The enemy described in propaganda broadcasts did not fully match the people they had encountered. This did not erase the suffering of the conflict. Cities had been destroyed. Families had been separated. Millions were dead across Asia and the Pacific. Nothing could undo that reality, but individual experiences had introduced something more complicated than hatred. They had introduced understanding. Years later, historians studying memoirs, interviews, and prisoner testimony would find a recurring pattern. Former Japanese servicemen often remembered specific acts of humanity with remarkable clarity. Names were sometimes forgotten, dates occasionally blurred, yet memories of nurses offering comfort during illness or recovery frequently remained vivid decades afterward. In many cases, these encounters became among the first personal connections between former enemies. During the transition from war to peace, the guns had fallen silent, but the consequences of those small acts of compassion were only beginning to unfold. The men who survived would soon return to a transformed nation, carrying stories that few people back home expected to hear. The journey home began slowly. Japan's surrender ended the fighting, but it did not instantly return millions of soldiers, sailors, and airmen to their families. Across the Pacific and Asia, former prisoners waited for transportation, medical clearance, and repatriation. Many Japanese pilots who had survived combat injuries remained hospitalized for weeks or months. After the war's conclusion, when they finally departed American facilities, they left with more than healed wounds. They carried memories. The Japan to which they returned was dramatically different from the country they had left. Entire districts of major cities had been reduced to rubble. Factories lay silent. Transportation networks struggled to function. Food shortages affected millions. Families searched for missing relatives. Veterans stepped off ships and trains into communities still trying to comprehend the scale of defeat. For former pilots, the adjustment was often difficult. Many had lost friends, squadron members, and instructors. Some returned with permanent injuries from crashes, burns, or combat wounds. Others carried psychological scars that were less visible but equally lasting, yet among their stories of battle and survival. Another subject occasionally emerged. American medical care. Relatives and neighbors were often surprised by these accounts. Wartime propaganda had painted a very different picture of captivity. Many civilians expected stories of mistreatment or abuse. Instead, some returning servicemen described hospitals where doctors operated on enemy wounded, where medicine was provided without discrimination, and where nurses showed kindness to men who had once flown missions against American forces. These stories did not instantly change public opinion. The wounds of war remained fresh. Grief and hardship touched nearly every family. Nevertheless, first-hand testimony carried a credibility that propaganda no longer possessed. A former pilot could point to scars left by surgery performed in captivity. Another could describe the nurses who cared for him during recovery. Others recalled receiving food, medicine, and treatment they had never expected to receive from an enemy. Such accounts gradually became part of a broader process unfolding throughout post-war Japan. The nation was reassessing many assumptions that had shaped the warriors, and among the memories surviving veterans carried home, some of the most unexpected involved acts of compassion encountered in places where they had expected only fear. Those memories would continue to influence perceptions long after the physical wounds of war had begun to heal. As the years passed, the significance of those hospital encounters became clearer. The Second World War had left enormous scars across the Pacific. Entire nations faced the challenge of rebuilding cities, economies, and political systems. Yet reconstruction was not only physical, it was also psychological. Former enemies had to learn how to exist in a world where the war was over. For many Japanese veterans, That process began with personal experiences rather than diplomatic agreements. Before they read official statements or studied new histories, they remembered individual people, a doctor who saved a life, a corpsman who carried a wounded man from wreckage, a nurse who sat beside a hospital bed during a difficult night. These memories often stood in sharp contrast to the wartime images had once dominated military training and public propaganda. Historians examining post-war memoirs and interviews have repeatedly found evidence of this pattern. Former prisoners did not all share identical experiences, and captivity varied across different locations and circumstances. Yet many accounts describe surprise at the professionalism and humanity encountered in American medical facilities. For some veterans, those experiences became an important lesson about the dangers of dehumanization. War requires people to identify enemies. It often encourages them to see opponents as symbols rather than individuals. Hospitals operated differently. Within a medical ward, a wounded pilot was no longer primarily a combatant, he was a patient. His nationality remained unchanged, but his immediate needs were human rather than military. That distinction mattered. Acts of care did not erase the suffering caused by the war. They did not undo battles, bombings, or years of violence. What they did accomplish was something smaller and, in many ways, more remarkable. They demonstrated that compassion could survive even in the aftermath of bitter conflict. The nurses who treated Japanese prisoners rarely knew how long those memories would endure. Most simply performed their duties according to professional standards and personal conviction, yet decades later, some of those routine acts would still be remembered by the men who received them. A blanket adjusted during recovery, a reassuring smile after surgery, a quiet effort to ease pain. Small moments, but history is often shaped by small moments. When former Japanese pilots reflected on captivity years afterward, many remembered not only the end of a war, but the realization that humanity could appear in the most unexpected places, and that realization remains one of the most enduring legacies of their experience. The Pacific War was one of the most destructive conflicts in human history. It consumed cities, fleets, and entire generations. Millions of people experienced loss that would remain with them for the rest of their lives. Pilots vanished into the ocean. Families waited for letters that never arrived. Nations invested enormous effort into teaching their citizens who to fear and who to hate. Yet history is rarely defined only by battles. Sometimes it is shaped by moments that occur far from the front lines. A hospital room, a wounded pilot, a nurse performing what seemed like an ordinary task for the Japanese aviators who entered American medical care expecting cruelty. Those encounters became something unforgettable. The experience forced them to confront a reality that war had hidden from view. The people on the other side were human beings too. That realization did not erase the tragedy of the conflict. It did not change the outcome of the war or lessen the suffering endured across the Pacific, but it revealed something important about humanity. Even during an era defined by destruction, individuals still possess the ability to choose compassion over hatred, duty over revenge, and care over cruelty. Years later, many former pilots remembered aircraft, battles, and defeat. But some also remembered a nurse adjusting a blanket, a simple act. Yet in a world shattered by war, it carried a message more powerful than propaganda, more lasting than fear, and more enduring than the conflict itself. The war ended in 1945. The memory of that unexpected kindness did not.